James Brown walked into a rehearsal space in Cincinnati on a Tuesday morning in February 1970 and told his band to forget everything they knew about playing music. Not to play better, not to play differently, to forget. He had been awake for most of the previous 36 hours, sitting alone in his hotel room with a tape recorder and a notebook, and an idea that he couldn't quite catch. Something he could hear in his head, but that kept evading the moment he tried to put it into language or notation, or any of the forms that music normally takes before it becomes a recording. He knew what it felt like. He knew the rhythm of it, the weight of it, the specific physical quality of what he was trying to build. He just hadn't found the shape yet. The shape came in that Cincinnati rehearsal room in front of 12 musicians who were about to experience one of the most unusual creative sessions in the history of American popular music. What emerged from that session was "Get Up, I Feel Like Being a Sex Machine," a recording that would go on to become one of the most sampled songs in the history of recorded music. A foundational text of funk that influenced hip-hop, R&B, electronic music, and pop in ways that are still being felt 50 years later. But on that Tuesday morning in February 1970, it was just James Brown trying to explain to 12 musicians how to forget what they knew. The instruction sounded impossible, which Brown understood. He didn't mean it literally. What he meant was something more specific and more radical, which was that the musical vocabulary his band had spent years developing, the horn arrangements, the complex chord structures, the sophisticated harmonic language of soul music at its most ambitious, all of it was getting in the way of something he was trying to reach. He was trying to get to something underneath all of that, something more fundamental, more physical, more direct in its relationship to the human body. "I want to feel the one," Brown told his band that morning. The phrase would become one of the most discussed concepts in funk music history. But in that rehearsal room in Cincinnati, it landed with confusion and silence from 12 professional musicians who had no immediate framework for what he was asking. The concept Brown was articulating was deceptively simple in description and enormously difficult in execution. In conventional soul and R&B music, the rhythmic emphasis typically fell on beats 2 and 4, the backbeat. Brown was proposing something different. He wanted the emphasis to fall on beat 1, the downbeat, and he wanted every instrument in the band to treat that downbeat as the most important moment in the bar, the moment everything was driving toward, the moment of arrival rather than the moment of anticipation. This sounds like a small technical adjustment. It was not. It required his musicians to fundamentally reorient their relationship to time, to rebuild from the ground up how they thought about the space between notes and the weight assigned to each beat. It required the drummer to think differently. It required the bass player to think differently. It required the horn section, which was accustomed to functioning as harmonic decoration, to think about itself as a rhythmic instrument in a way that classical training and years of professional experience had not prepared any of them for. The drummer that morning was Clyde Stubblefield, who would become one of the most sampled drummers in history, his patterns on this and other recordings forming the rhythmic foundation beneath some of the most famous hip-hop recordings of the 1980s and 1990s. Stubblefield had been playing drums professionally since his early teens. He had played with some of the best musicians in the country. He understood rhythm with a depth that most drummers only aspired to. When Brown told him to feel the one, Stubblefield listened, processed it, and started experimenting. What he produced in the next hour of rehearsal was not yet the pattern that appears on the recording. It was a series of attempts to understand what Brown was asking for, each one bringing him closer to the specific physical sensation that Brown kept describing in terms that were more about feeling than instruction. "Heavier," Brown would say. "More weight on the one. Make me feel it." Stubblefield would adjust. Brown would listen, nod, or shake his head, and the process would continue. The bass player was Bobby Bird's cousin, a young musician named Tim Drummond who had joined the band relatively recently. Drummond had been trained in conventional bass technique, which meant his instinct was to play notes that supported the harmonic structure of the music, to move with the chord changes in ways that made the music feel full and rich. Brown wanted him to do something different. He wanted the bass to anchor the groove rather than decorate it, to function as a rhythmic anchor alongside the drums, rather than as a harmonic instrument that happened to have a rhythmic role. This instruction was also more complex than it sounds. Drummond spent the morning session working through different approaches, playing lines that were simpler and more repetitive than anything his training suggested was interesting, discovering that the repetition itself was the point, that the power came from restraint rather than elaboration. The horn section, which included some of Brown's most skilled musicians, faced perhaps the hardest adjustment. Horns in soul music were expected to be expressive, to carry melodic lines, to add color and texture and harmonic richness. Brown was asking them to become rhythmic punctuation, short, sharp, syncopated blasts that emphasized the groove rather than adorned it. "Hit it and quit it," Brown kept saying, a phrase that the musicians would remember for years. The idea was that every note the horns played should land like a punch rather than settle like a chord, should add emphasis rather than harmony. Bobby Bird, Brown's longtime collaborator and the other singer on the eventual recording, watched all of this from the side of the room and understood something that he articulated years later. He was watching James Brown invent funk music in real time in a rehearsal room in Cincinnati by teaching 12 professional musicians how to unlearn everything they had spent their careers developing. The song itself emerged from this process organically. Brown hadn't come to the rehearsal with a completed composition. He had a groove concept, the feeling of the one, and a rough sense of the energy he was trying to capture. The actual structure of Sex Machine developed through the rehearsal as the musicians found their way into the groove and Brown began to hear what the song wanted to be. The famous opening was not planned. Brown began calling out to the band during a run-through of the groove, and the call and response pattern that became the song's signature intro developed spontaneously from that exchange. "Get up, get into it, get involved," Brown called. The band responded with the groove. The interaction between Brown's vocal improvisation and the band's rhythmic foundation generated the structure that would be refined and recorded. The lyric "Sex Machine" itself emerged from Brown's sense of what the groove communicated physically. He was not using the phrase in a narrowly sexual sense, though that layer of meaning was certainly present. He was describing a kind of physical machine, a body in motion, the specific combination of human beings playing music that had been stripped down to its most essential physical elements. The groove itself was the machine, and the machine's purpose was to move, to create movement in everyone who heard it. Brown ran the band through the material repeatedly throughout that Tuesday. By the afternoon, the rough shape of the song had been established. By the evening, it had been refined to the point where Brown was satisfied enough to stop for the night, which was not the same as being finished, but was as close to finished as any James Brown composition ever got in the rehearsal phase. The recording session, held a few days later, was documented by Brown with his usual obsessive attention to technical detail. He had been recording his own live performances for years, partly to review his own work and partly to capture the spontaneous moments that happened in live settings that studio recordings often couldn't reproduce. He brought that same sensibility to the Sex Machine sessions, insisting on capturing the energy of the live rehearsal in the studio environment. The engineers who worked on the recording have described a session that was unlike any other they had been part of. Brown's direction was entirely in terms of feel, rather than technical instruction. He wasn't asking for specific adjustments to sound levels or microphone placement. He was asking whether the recording captured what it felt like to be in the room when the band played, whether the machine-like quality of the groove came through in the reproduction. When the master tape was complete, Brown listened back to the full recording several times, without saying anything. The engineers and musicians waited. Then Brown said it was done. Not that it was good or that he was satisfied or that it had met his expectations, just that it was done. That the thing he had been hearing in his hotel room in the previous weeks was now on tape. That the shape had been found. The release of Get Up, I Feel Like Being a Sex Machine in 1970 did not produce an immediate critical consensus about its significance. Some reviewers found it simple, repetitive, even crude compared to the sophisticated soul arrangements that Brown and others had been producing in the 1960s. They were not wrong that it was simpler. They were wrong about what simplicity meant in this context. They were encountering a fundamental shift in what Brown was trying to do with music and evaluating it by the standards of what he had been doing before, which was precisely the wrong frame. The audience understood it before the critics did, which is often how it works. The response to Sex Machine in black communities was immediate and physical. The song worked the way Brown had intended it to work, through the body rather than through the mind, bypassing analysis and connecting directly with something that didn't require explanation. Clyde Stubblefield later reflected on what had happened in that Cincinnati rehearsal room with a clarity that came from decades of perspective. He said that Brown had understood something in 1970 that most musicians wouldn't understand for another decade, which was that the future of popular music was going to be about rhythm in a way that hadn't been true before, that the groove itself was the carrier of meaning rather than the vessel that held melodic and harmonic content. Brown had heard hip-hop before it existed, had built the rhythmic vocabulary that producers would mine for decades, had created in one Cincinnati rehearsal session the sonic language that would underpin American popular music through the rest of the 20th century and well into the 21st. The most sampled drum break in history came from that session. It came from Clyde Stubblefield, following James Brown's instruction to forget everything he knew and feel the one. It came from 12 musicians who spent a Tuesday morning in February 1970 dismantling their own expertise in service of a groove that their bandleader could hear but couldn't describe, a groove he had been awake for 36 hours trying to find the shape of, a groove that turned out to be the future of music. James Brown never stopped working. He made more recordings, had more hits, continued to perform until late in his life with the same explosive energy that had defined his work for 50 years. But the musicians who were there on that Tuesday morning in Cincinnati would say for the rest of their careers that something specific and unrepeatable had happened in that room, that they had been present for the moment when the foundation of a new musical language was laid, one instrument adjustment and one instruction to forget at a time. If this story about creative reinvention, about the courage to dismantle what you've built in pursuit of something you can hear but not yet touch, and about what happens when a genius tells 12 professionals to forget everything they know, moved you, share it with someone who needs to hear that sometimes the most important step forward requires erasing what you've already learned. Subscribe for more stories about the moments when music changed forever in rooms that nobody was watching. And remember that the most important creative breakthroughs almost never announce themselves at the time.